And our last speaker of this third panel is going to be Issam Amro. He's a PhD researcher at University of Westminster, and his research mainly focuses on international disputes and the impact of economic sanction. He's also a certified lawyer in Lebanon and the UK, he engages in legal practice in the UK and the Middle East. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So, thank you for being here on a hot Friday. I recently realized that I have something in common with the EU's economic security toolkit, is that we are both somehow slow to respond or selective in responding. And this is definitely not out of neglect, but definitely by design. In my case, for example, my response time usually depends on two main things: how important the message is to me, and who am I receiving it from. And in many ways, this is how the EU now approaches market access under its economic security framework, where formally, the rule is still equal treatment. Yet in practice, the response increasingly depends on who the investor is, the sector they're investing in, and the risk attached to both the investor's nationality and the sector they aim to invest in. So my paper asks how the EU's emerging economic security toolkit is reshaping or redefining the practical operation of the most favored nation clause and non-discrimination in the EU's external economic relations. So my claim is not that the EU has abandoned MFN, and nor even that these measures are necessarily unlawful. My claim is that the baseline in which MFN operates has shifted. MFN remains formally in place, but now operates within security-conditioned categories. So for the sake of time, and that to ensure I don't rush, I will begin with my findings. 4 main findings I would like you to keep in mind: security filter, MFN, sanctions, dispute settlement. Security filter is where the current framework is not a set of separate instruments operating in isolation. They could be seen as such, but each would be very technical or very limited. It is a coherent framework, a coherent system. They create a layered system with a cumulative effect. Each instrument on its own is somehow technical or limited, but together are reshaping the market access environment. Second finding, MFN. MFN is formally unaffected. It remains intact. Where in classical trade and investment law we all studied, we learned that MFN's logic is that like situations are treated alike, with availability of narrow exceptions based on public order and security. In today's EU context, these exceptions are no longer narrow. They are transforming into the logic on how market access is actually structured. Third finding, sanctions. And this means to me for 2 reasons. One is that a huge part of my actual PhD research is on sanctions, and I needed some extra research. Second part is that it is now actually occupies a deeper influence. Sanctions generally matter nowadays, as we are witnessing unprecedented waves of sanctions, not just from the EU against Russia, from the US, and every other entity or country which has the power to sanction. But in particular, secondary sanctions and extraterritorial measures establish different legal environments for different investors. We can even categorize this as a pre-screening phase, where sanctions risk becomes part of the benchmark problem at the center of MFN. Third finding, dispute settlement. It is a major doctrinal shift, which requires proper naming. This shift should not be treated as a byproduct of the economic security toolkit. It should be recognized explicitly both in doctrine and in dispute settlement. So, a bit of data. The current EU screening environment shows that there are around 3,100 cases, 3,100 screening cases in 2024. 92% cleared within 2 weeks, and a rise in notification since 2021. So apparently the 92% is not slow. It's the whole framework that is. At the same time, 3 member states still do not have screening systems in place. However, as my former colleague spoke, now the new regulation in place will shift into a mandate of establishing screening mechanisms. A significant portion of FDI stock still passes through jurisdictions without fully operational screening framework. So what does this actually mean? Is that the issue is how screening operates, not if it exists, because it clearly does. The system is uneven across member states, so it creates differentiated entry conditions. I named the security filter as my first finding. So what do I mean by that? It is a concept that indicates a structural transformation is underway. Investors no longer approach a neutral legal field and then encounter occasional exceptions. They come in with they approach an increasingly risky field or a field that's pre-structured by risk. And I look at this in 3 layers. FDI screening being the first layer, with criterion such as sector sensitivity, state influence, corporate structure or the ownership structure, and public order. And as you can see, nationality is not mentioned explicitly, but you can read it between the lines. Second layer is sanctions and extraterritoriality. Some investors arrive with risk on their shoulders, with a banner on their forehead that says, "I'm risky." Evaluation at this point happens differently. It's not just treated as an inward capital, it is rather treated as inward risk-bearing capital. The third layer is the anti-coercion instrument and tools. Anti-coercion instrument is important because it makes the geopolitical dimension explicit. It shows that the EU is no longer reacting to direct market threats. It's no longer reacting to the direct threat, but it reacts to the strategic pressure which is being influenced on the EU itself from third countries. And it got me smiling because when I was preparing for this, it was the beginning of the World Cup. So it's somehow like how coaches shift the game from direct pressure, from direct threat to general pressure and scoring a last-minute goal. You move from defense to offense in one way or another. So what is the doctrinal point behind all of this? MFN is a comparator principle. So to determine if there is or if there has been less favorable treatment, we need to know what we're basing this treatment on. So who counts as being like situation? And that's where all the change is being done. My argument is that the EU's economic security turn is rewriting the answer itself. The field of comparison is now narrowing down. It's narrowing down into some investors are just non-comparable by nature due to the strategic risk they hold, the technological risk they hold, and the geopolitical risk they hold. And the result is not that the EU is abandoning MFN again, but rather re-anchoring it with differentiated risk categories. So based on all of this, my hypothesis is that the EU's shift towards risk-based economic security governance should be understood as a deliberate move towards security-conditioned categories of market access for third countries, capital and trade. In that model, MFN and non-discrimination are re-anchored within differentiated risk tiers rather than a presumably uniform and open market for everyone. Even if this remains formally compatible with the existing law, it still represents a substantive readjustment, a substantive shift that requires naming. So, Now that I've established my findings and my claim, my argument, a bit of research and methodology to explain. This paper, first of all, sits at an intersection of three different conversations. They are often kept apart. The first is the literature on MFN and non-discrimination in trade and investment law. The second is the expanding literature over the past few years on the EU's economic security, strategic autonomy, and FDI screening. So on one hand, we have MFN and investment law. On the other hand, we have FDI screening and EU's economic security. And on the other hand, third is the literature on sanctions, coercion, and geo-economic governance. So my contribution is to bring these together and to argue that the transformation of MFN cannot be understood by looking at one of them in isolation without the other. So methodologically, the paper combines doctrinal legal analysis with a political economy reading on judgments on the EU's geo-economic approach. On the doctrinal side, it examines the EU's primary and secondary law relating to FDI screening, outbound investment control, and the coercion instruments. On the political economy side, it asks how ideas such as risk, dependency, reliance, strategic rivalry are being translated into legal categories. Because I was once told by my PhD supervisor that whenever a debate is political, the flip side of the coin is a legal question. So, back to dispute settlement, which was my fourth finding. No forum is seeing the whole transformation I am talking about. Not that I'm smarter than them, but the thing is that the WTO panels will increasingly be asked to assess whether security-based differentiation fits within the exceptions, the existing exceptions. The EU law asks internal questions of competence, institutional balance, proportionality, which is key in many cases, even as the one mentioned in the Xella judgment. Investment arbitration, tribunals will face claims involving differential treatment, legitimate expectations, and the invocation of essential security interests. So to conclude, economic security turn is instituting a new organizing logic for external economic policy. MFN has not vanished, it just operates in a different environment. Security-defined filters at the level of FDI entry, sanctions risk, strategic dependency, and related trade instruments are established as filters. So the consequence is a move from equal treatment across a uniform market to equal treatment within differentiated risk categories. And I finally say, this shift should be named. It should be named and addressed directly, rather than left to appear as a technical side effect or byproduct of the economic security governance. Thank you so much.